Hi, High Rock. My name is KAT HAMPSON, and I'm the pastor at High Rock Brookline. In some ways, you can say I'm relatively new. I started at High Rock Brookline just 5 months ago. But if you're like, her face seems familiar, and I've definitely seen her in other places at High Rock, you're not wrong. High Rock has been a big part of my life, and my family's life, for close to 15 years now. I started going to High Rock as a college student, got married at High Rock, then my husband and I became part of the High Rock Quincy church plant, and I led worship there and was on pastoral staff there, up until this spring when I transitioned to Brookline. And so, all this to say that the broader High Rock network has been where I've called home. So I'm thrilled to be speaking with you today in this space. Because even if I don't know you yet, you are family to me. And every family has its own characteristic set of family values. And for the past 4 weeks, we've been in a sermon series looking at the values that make High Rock, well, High Rock. All of our congregations in our network got together and asked, what are the distinct ways that we as a church and as a people are seeking to follow Jesus? What values of Jesus do we want to reflect and embody? If this is your first entry point into this series, I encourage you to watch the previous weeks on High Rock Online's YouTube channel. We talk about honesty, curiosity, hospitality, and humility. And today, we're going to be looking at the fifth and final High Rock value, solidarity. Some of you are hearing me say that word, and already you might be giving me the side eye. You might be thinking, oh no, is she going to talk about some kind of, leftist thing? You know what? I know where you're coming from. The word solidarity can be really tricky to talk about, particularly with all the political overtones that society has associated with it. If you're wondering, what does solidarity actually mean? You're definitely not the only one asking that question. 3 out of 5 Google searches containing the word solidarity are actually asking for the definition. Solidarity is one of High Rock's values, not because of any political agenda, but because it's something that Jesus himself embodies with his whole life. And if we identify as Jesus followers, then the way of Jesus should form how we understand and practice solidarity. So maybe solidarity wasn't a word you were too familiar with. Maybe you were one of the folks who asked Google. You know what? At one point, that was me too. Sociologists define solidarity as social cohesion, the thing that holds individuals in a society together. And so regardless of our familiarity with any technical definition, we've all felt solidarity in some sense. Here's what I mean. I'm Filipino, but I spent the first 18 years of my life in the United Arab Emirates. Now, both of my parents are Filipino overseas workers who moved from the Philippines to seek better jobs abroad when I was just a baby. So, I'm an international expat Filipino third culture kid who grew up in the Middle East and who spoke English as a first language. And so if there's anyone who's similar to me who shares any of those kinds of experiences as well, I immediately gravitate towards them. There's that spark, and I know that I'm not alone, and I'm part of a group, niche as it may be. And we all feel this way, naturally, when we're around people who are most like us, because we share common identities, experiences, values, religious or political affiliations. They understand us. They get us. And we get them. You know solidarity when you're in another country and you hear someone speaking your language. You know solidarity when you show up at a Super Bowl party and finally one other person shows up wearing a jersey from your team. We value each other because we share core identities. Another way we all experience solidarity is when we share the same goal. And you and I find this on teams, sports teams, office work teams, study groups. We might be different from one another with very different core identities, but we hold together because we need each other to make this work. We value each other for the unique contributions each person brings. So before we go on, I want us to think about where we might have experienced solidarity, and whether it was solidarity based on shared core identities or solidarity based on shared goals. Take a moment to share in the chat or share with your neighbors around you. If talking about this with others isn't something you're able to do right now, consider jotting down thoughts for yourself. Welcome back. We experience both aspects of solidarity at work, in our neighborhood, even in our church. And both aspects of solidarity can be incredibly meaningful. But there are limits to even these types of solidarity. And when we hit those limits and experience the lack of solidarity instead of the love, it's painful. Even from a young age, I got the sense that society would treat me with more dignity, respect, access to resources, if I were white or if I were a man. I'm not saying that white people or men don't experience any personal disrespect or hardship, but I knew that there was a difference in how I was spoken to if I were on the phone with my American accent versus if someone actually saw me and my Filipino features in person. And there was a difference in how a man could walk down the same street and not get any of the cat calls and verbal harassment that I would get. And I vividly remember my mother explaining to me when I was 11 that when the job ads in the newspaper at that time said Western educated only, it was probably code back then for we're a white-led company. We'll only really consider other white applicants for this job. Even when someone like my dad had similar qualifications. And so my circle of solidarity grew smaller and smaller. I mean, if folks with power and access to resources and benefits were content to let these barriers keep on existing for me, then why should I try to make the effort to find any sense of solidarity with anyone else when solidarity would not be extended to me? In today's scripture passage from Philippians 2, the Apostle Paul is writing to the community of Jesus followers in the Roman colony of Philippi. And we get glimpses from the book of Acts about how radically diverse this community is in terms of ethnicity and gender, class and socioeconomic status. You had people like a wealthy luxury cloth dealer, a Roman jailer, a liberated slave girl, Jewish transplants from the diaspora. And so every time the community of Jesus followers came together to eat and to worship, there was a crossing of all kinds of levels of social boundaries. But this community was facing increasing external pressure in the form of social ostracism and persecution from the Roman Empire. And they were suffering as well from internal struggles of disunity within their own community. And some scholars believe that solidarity was starting to fracture over the issue of whether the Christian life was meant to include suffering. And so this had implications for those who had access to power and privilege because they were in danger of losing it. They risked going out of business because their customers took business elsewhere. They risked getting disowned by their family who didn't understand these new priorities. They risked losing their place on the board. They risked getting skipped for a promotion because someone else could provide a better connection to more elite networks. They risked living in more unsafe neighborhoods or letting unsafe people into their lives. And so they had a choice to make. Would they forsake the radical unity and diversity of God's kingdom vision just to grasp onto their social status? Or would they instead enter into suffering together alongside their fellow Christian sisters and brothers for the sake of the mission, and perhaps jeopardizing their own place on the ladder? And so Paul writes to them about suffering while he himself is incarcerated. He's incarcerated for sharing about how Jesus, not Caesar, is Lord, and how that changes everything. And so again and again, he urges the Philippian community not to run away from suffering, but instead to rejoice in sufferings. Because suffering is an invitation to join in with Jesus and all that he's doing and all that he's about. And Paul says nothing could make him happier than to see the Philippians united and in solidarity with one another, having the same love, being one in spirit and of one mind. But Paul knows just how much their relationship with power and privilege can get in the way, and he warns them, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of the others. Solidarity based on affinity can be a good thing. That is, until access to resources, opportunities, and advantages is only shared among those who look like us, think like us, and value and believe the same things as we do. So why would we share? We're winning. Solidarity based on contribution can also be a good thing until we start believing the lie that some kinds of people are worth being protected, valued, and honored, while other kinds of people are, well, disposable. As Pastor Megan spoke about in the sermon a few weeks ago on hospitality, it would be too easy for those of us with access to power and resources to say, I don't really need you. I got everything I need to figure this out. You're not worth my time or care. Paul knew that the Philippian church needed a solidarity that went deeper than all of that. But is there any kind of solidarity that would ultimately free us from those lies? I shared about the racism and the sexism I experienced growing up. But I was complicit in racism as well. One evening, when I was 12 years old, I was walking back late from school in a darkened alleyway when I was groped by someone I couldn't see clearly. Later, I was convinced that this person's skin was definitely darker than mine. Now, why? Why would I come to believe that person was darker skinned? Why? Why did my horrified and terrified 12-year-old mind come to that image? Yes, in that instance, someone had violated the image of God in me, but I used that traumatic experience as an excuse to further dishonor the image of God in others. And so for years after that, I would turn away, without realizing it, from anyone with a darker skin color. Instead of celebrating differences and seeing the gifts of God in diversity, instead of treating Black and brown people as beloved of Jesus and made in the image of God, I used to use the phrase, "We're just different," as an excuse to cover up awkwardness, disdain, uneasiness, fear. And even when I knew I was complicit in letting discrimination or racism in the system continue, I framed my silence as, "I'm just looking out for myself." But going back to the passage, Paul is pleading for the church to have a solidarity that goes beyond social affiliation, status, or even utility. And he points at Jesus and says, effectively, follow Jesus in that kind of solidarity. That kind of solidarity. While we tend to exploit power and ambition for our own gain, he who was fully God himself and deserving of all the power in heaven and on earth, he laid it down. While we're singularly focused on status and privilege and our own safety, the passage in verse 3 calls it vain conceit or empty glory. Jesus, fully God and fully human, emptied himself of the glory that was rightfully his. And he did all this to enter into our reality of suffering under the systems of sin and evil, disparity and despair. That kind of solidarity, Jesus' solidarity, is solidarity into suffering, solidarity with those who are suffering. That solidarity brings us to freedom. And in the Gospels, we see examples of how Jesus entered into relationships and identified himself with the poor, the hungry, the sick, the stranger, the vulnerable, and the incarcerated, the least of these. He drew near to love particularly the folks on the margins. Any privilege he had, even as a human being, he leveraged to love the last, least, and lost. He was called a friend of tax collectors and sinners. He affirmed the humanity in those who were social outcasts. He healed and uplifted those with diseases and disabilities. And he showed them that even though the world had forgotten them or looked down on them, that their lives mattered to God, that they were welcome in the kingdom of God and worthy to be loved and cared for. I'm grateful for the reminders from Black and brown theologians that Jesus, fully God and fully human, was a brown, Middle Eastern man living in the shadow of Roman oppression, whose earthly parents had once been asylum seekers in Egypt. Jesus was beaten and died in a violent execution that was reserved for only the worst of criminals, the cross. To fully identify, he fully identified with humanity's struggle with sin and evil. He laid down his life in love in order to lift us up towards a new life with God and with each other. And so when Jesus invites us to follow him, We're invited to embody that same solidarity, one that subverts and transforms all other definitions. We're given a new identity, a new family, and a new allegiance. And because we now belong to Jesus, we now belong to each other, first and foremost, and not just to people who look, think, and act like us. Scripture is full of stories of women and men who laid down their power and used their access to resources, opportunities, social position, not for themselves, but for the sake of others. They leveraged what they had because they were following Jesus, because they were being invited into God's grand story of his presence with his people. And in doing so, they exposed oppression, they tackled injustice, they led sacrificial lives of courage and love and freedom. I highly recommend Dominique Gilliard's book, Subversive Witness, to go deeper into these real-life scriptural examples and prompt us to consider what solidarity might look like for you, for me, for us. Where might we be invited by Jesus to find freedom in solidarity by laying down and leveraging what we have, whether in terms of access to resources, networks, platforms, status, laying down and leveraging what we have for those on the margins. The Apostle Paul himself had a story of his own, where he didn't find full life until he lived in solidarity with the people he had once oppressed. And Jesus' invitation changed Paul's life, and this experience of being freed from old ways compelled him to live his life for the freedom in Jesus for everyone. I was on campus ministry staff in 2014, the year that Michael Brown and Eric Garner, two unarmed black men, were killed by police officers. When the news broke out, I admit I didn't know what to make of it. I noticed a lot of my white friends and acquaintances saying things like, let's not jump to conclusions, and let's wait for more evidence. While my black friends and acquaintances were crying out and saying, you don't understand. This happens to us. It has been happening to us for a long time. While my Asian friends and acquaintances just stayed silent. I went to a college-sponsored event for black students to process their emotions, and I heard student after student say through tears, I'm scared for my father. I'm scared for my autistic younger brother who doesn't know how to act in these situations. And this could have been me. But the reckoning for me finally came when I was leading a Bible study on the story of the Good Samaritan with a diverse group of students. And I asked the typical questions, are you the priest or are you the Levite? Trying to get the students to consider what it means to be a neighbor to those who are hurting. And one of my black students looked me in the eye and said, I'm neither. I'm the man left dead on the side of the road, whom everyone is passing by without so much as a glance. We are hurting, and no one is doing anything about it. God broke my heart at that moment and opened my eyes to how, for so many years, I had allowed the lies of racism to seep into my soul, how I had left my brothers and sisters of color bleeding on the side of the road. And that was my moment of repentance and the start of Jesus inviting me into solidarity with him and thus into solidarity with the people whose lives mattered to him. When George Floyd was murdered last year, it seemed that for a powerful moment, There was a racial reckoning in this country. Maybe even some of you here heard Jesus' invitation into solidarity then for the first time. In the days immediately following, early June 2020, there was a tremendous surge in Google searches for the word solidarity. But just as quickly as it shot up in the trends, it plummeted back down. People lost interest in long-term solidarity. As Christians, we all want to love. But the problem is that a lot of us don't know what love looks like in these situations. And so we settle for some watered-down version of it that convinces us we're like Jesus. Well, in fact, we end up walking by the beaten man on the side of the road. But solidarity in the way of Jesus is not a feeling. It is relationship and action. Solidarity in the way of Jesus is not just a one-time reaching out of the hand, but it is a linking arms with our sisters and brothers. Solidarity in the way of Jesus is placing their needs before our own, committing our lives to seek their flourishing, and laying down and leveraging our own access to opportunities, platforms, resources in order to lift up our sister and our brother first. I found that the posture of listen, learn, lament, link arms has been helpful in taking us through the steps of practicing and pursuing solidarity, particularly for those of us, you and I, who do have access to those opportunities, platforms, resources. What would it look like to listen, really listen, with empathy and compassion? Listening is not about problem solving, but about taking a posture of humility and entering into the experience of our neighbors who might be struggling with pain, poverty, isolation, and discrimination. We need to listen to them when they identify what they need to be healthy, whole, and connected in community. And we need to not assume that we always know what is best. And so once we start to listen, we realize that there is so much to learn, especially when it comes to broader issues and historical systems of subjugation or marginalization, because we learn how they affect all of us. And I'm so glad to see folks taking part in the Justified Anger Black History for a New Day course. I pray that God uses that to spur us on to deeper understanding and commitment to kingdom justice. On the evening of March 16 this past spring, High Rock Online held a forum hosted by several Asian American High Rockers to share our experiences about racism, as well as, share about things we all had in common. And that night, I went to bed feeling warm and fuzzy, feeling loved and known within my High Rock family. But that same night in Atlanta, Georgia, a white man shot 8 people, 6 of them being women of Asian descent. And I woke up to the horror of the news the next morning and just could not move for grief and trauma. But that's when I saw High Rock come alongside me and Asian American sisters and brothers in solidarity. Our Black, brown, and white sisters and brothers called to check in. They opened up safe spaces to process. They offered support and food. They prayed over us. They took anti-harassment bystander trainings. They held a space of lament with other churches in the Boston area. And they started to organize things like the Asian American Theology Lab, so we as a community could learn more through the testimonies and faith expressions of Asian American Christians. To practice lament, to sit with God and each other in the grief and loss is so important, because it reminds us of how much we need Christ's healing and hope in these places. To link arms is to leverage our knowledge, resources, relationships, and position to seek the flourishing of others. And I'm proud to say that I've seen many ways that individuals, congregations, and our whole High Rock network has been striving to pursue solidarity better. Folks serving in the accessibility ministry are trying to live out what it looks like to have meaningful relationships with cognitively disabled children and their families. They've linked arms in love to seek the wholeness of this community. High Rockers have also been leveraging their resources and networks in order to link arms with local community organizations to address the mental health crisis. And I pray that we would normalize asking for help, and that we would sit with each other in our struggles, that we would grow even more to advocate for more therapists and social workers that would help in de-escalation in tense situations, especially where police forces are already overwhelmed. Misión de Caridad is an organization founded by a High Rocker to provide needed resources for refugee, migrant, and vulnerable women at the border. What would it look like for the people of God to come together, to put love in action, because we believe that God has called us to love the widow, the orphan, and the foreigner? Linking arms sometimes also means being willing to lay down one's life for the sake of another. And for justice, I know that several High Rockers have trained in de-escalation and marshalling for nonviolent actions in the tradition of the Black Civil Rights Movement. And these are people who choose to submit to the leadership of folks of color at a protest, but who have committed to be the first to stand in front of the line of traffic for the safety of those demonstrating for change. High Rock, let the Spirit lead your imagination to go wild. What would the world look like if the people of God were in solidarity with the last, the least, and the lost? How might living in the way of Christ's solidarity call us to seek the flourishing of those with housing or food insecurity, with those on the margins and on the side of the road? And what is God's invitation to solidarity for you personally? We're often tempted to seek systemic answers that don't require any personal long-term commitment from us, to seek quick-fix solutions without submitting to the wisdom of those who have actually experienced it. No, my challenge for each and every one of us, High Rock, is to seek solidarity grounded in relationship. Who is that one person who is different from you in terms of access to resources or maybe mental or physical ability, who you will commit to building a relationship with and listening to in order to enter their world? If you feel like you already have those relationships of trust and accountability, then ask that person what it is you should lay down in order to share in solidarity. And then go and do it. The Apostle Paul knew what the Philippian church was up against. For those of us who are really comfortable in life, this call to solidarity can be scary because it feels like it's costing us a lot. But when we try to hold on tightly to what we have, our jobs, our possessions, our reputation, we don't realize how we are trapped. We're trapped in anxiety about losing it all. We're trapped in cycles of comparison, division, poverty, and shame. But Jesus offers freedom. And in order for us to experience that freedom, we're invited to walk with Jesus in solidarity. Jesus Christ is the God who is with us, who is for us. He is the God who lays down his life in order to lift us up. And if we're called to follow Jesus, we're called to no longer live for ourselves, but to die to ourselves so that Christ can rise and live in and through us. Solidarity is love in action. Jesus is giving us, as he gave all his disciples, a new commandment, a new identity marker. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. Church, let that love be seen in the way we practice and pursue solidarity.